Hi, I'm Joe Pedoto. My name is not important. The name that I want you to remember tonight is Joe Kubert. Joe Kubert is a legend in the comic book field. He's important because it was his experience in 1952 while he was serving in the U.S. Army in Germany, and he saw some German magazines that had red-green anaglyph photos printed in them. He had actually started in the comic book field when he was 16 years old back in the 30s. And he was a partner with a fellow named Norman Maurer. They ran a little studio together, and when he got out of the service, he said, "Gee, Norman, I'd love to be able to do some 3D in comic books." He had no idea that a Frenchman 100 years prior had already invented the anaglyph system, so he reinvented the anaglyph system. In those days, it was all red and green. Norman Maurer had a connection with the Three Stooges. He was married to Ann Howard, whose father was Moe Howard, better known just as Moe of the Three Stooges. And so the very first 3D page that they created was a Three Stooges page. Norman had a brother named Leonard, and Leonard was a real printing expert. They spent all day creating this page. Leonard went out to Long Island, where he had access to a printing press, and he printed off a few of these proof sheets, ran them back into Manhattan, only to discover that nobody had thought about glasses. What they wound up doing was they wound up going around to candy stores, and at the time there were penny lollipops, which had a cellophane wrapping on them that corresponded with the flavor. Cherry for red, green for lime. And they actually bought these lollipops and, with an X-Acto knife and some cardboard, made their first pair of anaglyph glasses. They brought this to a fellow named Archer St. John, who had a comic publishing company, and he was knocked out. He wanted to make his entire line 3D. He said, the first one that we're going to do is Mighty Mouse. We're going to take existing story art, and I'm just going to have you two guys convert it into 3D. So it was actually redrawn by Joe Kubert and Norman Maurer. The system, and you're going to see an example of this, is borrowed from the cell acetate system that was used for hand-drawn animation. The backing board that they use was something called craft tint. Craft tint is like a stiff Bainbridge board, but it has a special coating on it. And you get two different developing fluids for it. And depending upon which fluid you brush on it, you get a lighter halftone pattern or a darker halftone pattern. They were losing color, so they wanted to have texture. And then every 3D element is on a separate sheet of acetate. The main system that was developed led to really 6 levels of depth. The craft tint and then 5 sheets of acetate on top of it. Why that limitation? They found that the cameras that were shooting them at the time couldn't focus well enough. After you got like 5 sheets of acetate laid on top, the layers started to get blurry. So there are no 1950s comic books that have more than 6 levels of depth. 2 other things before we begin. The popular fad in films, now these were not anaglyphs, sometimes there's a little confusion to that. The films of the 1950s were polarized projection, and the fad in Hollywood ran 52, 53, and 54. In those 3 years, Hollywood produced exactly 50 3D movies of varying quality, both in terms of content and stereoscopic depth. In the 9 months that was the boomlet in 1950s 3D comics, coincidentally, they also produced 50 comics. Nobody set out to do this, but just kind of a weird bit of synchronicity. And one other point to begin. On this screen, you see a long list of varying genres in the comic book field. One of the saddest things that's happened since that time is that comic books have devolved to be, in America anyway, to be mostly about superheroes. There was a time in America where there was a comic book genre for everyone. And we're going to try and show you examples of all those. So, a quote from Joe Kubert. Going to show you all 50 covers. No, you don't have to have your glasses on yet. I'll tell you when. So as I told you, Mighty Mouse was the first one, a character that Joe Kubert did, Dinosaurs and Cavemen tour, Three Stooges, a Mad magazine knockoff, horror. These, you can see that these all have this little logo in the upper right-hand corner, St. John's. Again, all of the St. John's 3D comic books, Western, Abbott and Costello, a child's book. Then we get into some others, Dell and Harvey. There were many imitators in this field, and of course DC with Superman. The Dell comics with Fluky Luke and Rudy Kazudi, you'll see examples of them in a moment. They are different because they actually use photographs. They're not line drawings. They're not on acetate. Everything else here will be acetate. Again, pinups, kid comics, westerns, Felix, romance, religion, comics for every taste. Jungle Thrill, Super Animals. Three-dimensional Nudnik? No. You can really see the variety, and this was reflective of the variety of genres of comic books of the day. Again, romance, Maggie and Jig, Sad Sack, battle action, Western action, jumping out of a plane without opening your parachute? Well, yeah, okay, 3D. These are the last two 3D comic books printed in 1954. These used a different system, and these are a wholly other thing. So they're not included in tonight's show, but they are phenomenal. The art is incredible, and really something to see in projection. This is from the inside cover of the three-dimension comic starring Mighty Mouse. Almost every 3D comic came bound with one or two pairs of glasses. You had to assemble them. One other thing about Mighty Mouse comics, they had an initial print run of 1 million. They sold it out. They had another print run of 1.5 million. They sold that out. They sold 2.5 million copies at 25 cents a copy when comic books were at that time 10 cents. Now, this is from, there's another great comic artist named Jack Kirby. This is from an original character that he created, Captain 3D. On the far side of the screen, you'll see that back lower panel. That's the craft tint board. And you can see that there are duotones on there. That was brushed on. And then each of those other layers are drawn on in ink. And then those figures are opaque. Then there's the framing, which is all opaque around the panel borders, and the captions, the back of which is also all opaque. Now put on your 3D glasses. This is what that page looks like as it was printed. I had the great good fortune to have a phenomenal 3D mentor. He's here tonight, Gerald Marks, and he developed some techniques to enhance and improve and make these faded, non-acid-free paper, this very cheap pulp printing, look, I think, spectacular in projection. And it is his skill set that has created this entire show. So I want to give a shout out there. And this is the result. To try and get the paper white, the technique is we deal in Photoshop channels. Remember that all of these were done for red-green, and we have converted them to red cyan. This is a house ad. This is again St. John's. I wanted to include this because it had examples of the first three and the three biggest selling 3D comic books in the 50s. This is kind of a first to marketplace, first to the jackpot. This again, this is a splash page from one of the stories. This was a story that was originally drawn and printed in 2D, and then was redrawn and converted into 3D using this cell acetate method. A splash page opening up, you see the Norman Maurer's signature up there for the Three Stooges. Regardless of your artistic preferences, the St. John's comics were great. This is Joe Kubert's self-portrait in the little circle there, and this is his caveman character, Tor. A little anachronistic. We all know cavemen didn't live with dinosaurs, except for the Flintstones. Beautiful line art, and he is one of the masters of the medium. Now, don't let anybody tell you that 3D comics were not educational, because they were, goddammit. Here's a page that tells you about the Triceratops. This is art by a fellow named Russ Heath, another phenomenal draftsman. And you learn the very important fact that whenever there's a T-Rex, he will fight with a Triceratops. So, hey, Mom, don't take my comic books away. Harvey was one who published Captain 3D. That's Captain 3D in the corner there. And we're going to see some examples from 3 of the 4 issues. Again, this is another house ad in 3D, in a 3D comic saying, buy our other 3D comics. Here's 3D Dolly. I like this page particularly because of what I think is a very clever effect. I love the balloon. I love the fact that you've got, a tint on that balloon that's in 3D and yet transparent. A very nice little effect. These artists were largely unsung. They were paid a page rate, and that was all. And to my way of thinking, it's phenomenal, the effort and the artistic integrity that they brought to these tasks. Now this is Fluky Luke. This was a kid's show on TV, very different from everything else that we've seen before. These are actually paper mache heads on models and actors, and they are photographed with a realist camera, and then actual photographs used. This and the Rudy Kazudi, of those 50, are the only 2 that use actual 3D photographs. This is a splash page from Captain 3D. This is drawn by the amazing Jack Kirby. He was just a comic creator who could do it all. Didn't matter what the assignment was, he excelled. The previous Jack Kirby page was drawn for 3D. This Superman was a previously published story that was redrawn, recreated for 3D. Not as many levels of depth, and they would often add like a smoke effect that wasn't in the original page for another 3D element. Same thing here. Bob Kane never drew most of the Batman stories that you've seen, although you see his signature on all of them. Again, this was a 2D story that was converted to 3D. I wanted to show an example of how they would repurpose the art. There's a panel. It's from a story called The Robot Robbers. There's the robot up there. And you can see the differences. They would literally just lay the acetate over the original stats, or original artwork if they still had it laying around, and they would redraw it. So you can see that although the elements are similar, the plane is different. The shadowing is not the same. On the bottom of that tower, you have like actual portholes. Here you just have a suggestion of portholes. My girlfriend. Now it says W. Morgan Thomas. Don't believe it for a minute. It's the great Will Eisner, an amazing creator. His most famous creation is the Spirit. The rest of the story might have 4 levels of depth. The splash page usually had the full 6 levels, and this I think was a beautiful example. And thanks to the techniques that Gerald Marks developed, we're really able to bring this out. I think in projection, this page looks phenomenal. And she is my girlfriend. Why did you laugh? Now, from my girlfriend to romance comics, there's a team called Ross and Andrew. They are most celebrated for their characters, the Metal Men, in the early 60s. But in the 50s, they did whatever was popular. Romance was huge at that time, far outselling superhero comics. Another one that I thought was, a particularly nice example, kind of the montage, the cocktail shakers, the martini glasses. And that fellow, he's just a cad. Well, of course, if you were a woman, you had to love anybody who went to the Club 700. That's where everybody went. You all know Katy Perry. This is Katie Keene. This is before Katy Perry was made fully three-dimensional. She was Katie Keene. This was again a huge genre. Basically, she was a kind of a fashion model character, and girls bought it for the fashion and boys bought it for the leg art. The unique hook was that they would solicit hairstyles and garters and stockings and dresses and swimsuits. And so you can see along the bottom, Katie's outfit by Sally Michelet of Century Boulevard in Buffalo, New York. So you kind of help to build your audience saying, oh God, is Katie going to wear my dress in the next comic book? And almost every page you would find these credits for her hairdo, her stockings, her other paraphernalia. She's reading a book that's called How to Reduce by I'm a Fatso. So you can see this body image shaming stuff is not new at all. This is one example of the 3D comics, the first Christmas, or a religious comic. This is Panelorama, a two-page spread from the middle of the comic book. It's good, but it could be much better. There's something in comic art and in graphics in general called spotting your blacks. And spotting your blacks really means the careful placement of shadow to help define 3D space. This is good, but I think it would be magnificent if there were some darker shadows to help pull out those different levels. Like this. This is from a Harvey series. The character is the Hawk. Again, a splash page, so there was more attention to detail in this, and I think an excellent example of spotting your blacks. I think that even though there are no more levels in this than the previous image, this is much more vibrant, seems more 3D, just because of the higher level of skill of the inker. Again, another splash page from the Hawk. I love this one with the lizard, the skull, the birds in the background, and again, you remember that the toning in the back here, a lot of it tended to drop out, but that's from that craft tint board. 3D-O-Rama. Now this was the wraparound cover, which was in full color on the original comic book, and then in the center spread was this version. I didn't have a great copy of this. It took a lot of time. This is a reason why kids got excited about these comics. I think this was, this was the VR of its time. Wonderful, attention to detail and very skillful spotting of blacks. It's in graphic art and comic line art, it's a very important skill to have. We're going to see examples from 3 of these Harvey publications. Probably Harvey and EC produced the most level of depths and had some of the best artists working for them. Again, just a house ad. One thing, especially to point out is they're telling you these are not conversions. These were shot in 3D, not like Batman versus Superman. These were especially drawn for 3D. So even in that 9-month period, people understood there was a difference between remaking an old story and designing a new story to be presented in 3D. Jungle Tales, and again, the anatomically correct woman of 1953. Both her breasts are at least as large as her head, and her waist is the same size as her neck. That's what I want in every woman I date. A wonderful example of, if you're going to have a 3D effect, throw a spear at the audience. Now here's an example where instead of coming out, you're going in. This is another Harvey title. I think sophisticated audience today can see, comparing this, say, to one of the earlier slides of say, Mighty Mouse, this was definitely drawn and designed to be presented in 3D. This was not a conversion. And even the use of just the pure red to kind of give you another little color in there, very, very, nice effect. This is, again, Howard Nostron art. About an Italian race car driver. I'm Italian. I drive my car fast. All Italians drive their cars fast. This is exactly how I'll be going back to Connecticut later tonight. And again, you can see deliberately, thoughtfully laid out for 3D printing. A car hurtling towards you. These bales of hay coming out. Also, elements like breaking the panel borders. It was a cliche of the comics at the time, but I think here's an example of effective use of that. Now this is again 3D-O-Rama. This was in a battle comic, and this was a famous historical event in 3D. It wasn't terribly historical because it was only about 10 years in the past. And I thought that to close the show, this was a particularly nice example of what was done with craft tint board, a few sheets of acetate, some whiteout, and an ink pen. Very, very low tech, kind of shows the hands of the creator. I thought this would be a fitting close. Presentation is dedicated to Joe Kubert and Norman Maurer, who started it all, Ray Zone, who picked up the torch and became the king of 3D comics, and Gerald Marks, my 3D mentor.